Our next round of FAMM is starting soon. Are you ready to elevate your women's health practice? To have the tools to support your clients with menstrual cycle issues, including irregular cycles, hormone imbalances, abnormal bleeding, period pain, and other similar situations? Are you ready to gain the skills to teach fertility awareness to your clients and have the tools to interpret even the most complex menstrual cycle charts? That's where our Fertility Awareness Mastery mentorship comes in. Join the waiting list to be notified when registration opens before anyone else. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMWL to join the waiting list today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMWL. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 559. Today, I'm sharing another brand new episode in our FAMM research series. This topic was actually brought to me by one of our FAMM practitioners who expressed interest in it. And the topic of ADHD, of course, I am not an expert in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it was brought to my attention the potential correlation between symptoms and the menstrual cycle. So in today's FAMM research series, we are diving into a research article that looked at that specific question to try to determine if there was a link between symptoms and the menstrual cycle. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the potential link and how that could affect women who struggle with this condition. The title of the study we're going to be diving into today is Reproductive Steroids and ADHD Symptoms Across the Menstrual Cycle. A bit of background information about ADHD. It was once thought to be only a disorder that affected males, leaving women and girls to kind of fend for themselves. And the ratio of boys to girls with ADHD in childhood is about 3-1, whereas in adulthood, it's actually closer to 1-1. So when we look at the research into ADHD, it would suggest that girls may be presenting differently with these symptoms than boys, or providers may be more used to identifying it in boys and how it might show up in them. And so many girls who may be struggling with this condition may not be actually getting those diagnoses in childhood. And more women are starting to get these diagnoses in adulthood, maybe because they've noticed certain traits and certain symptoms or certain attention related issues in themselves, and they're starting to look for more support with it. So before we get into the study, I'm just going to share a little bit more about the background, because it is interesting to see the difference between how men and women are being cared for and how this is being identified based on those sex differences. So there are a couple key sex differences that have been identified in the research, and one of those differences is the characteristics, the way that women present with it, the kinds of things that show up more in women compared to men. And so women tend to present when they have ADHD with decreased self-esteem, more difficulty in relationships, an increased likelihood of anxiety and other similar types of issues. And women are more likely to present with the inattentive, so attention-related issues rather than the hyperactive symptoms, which the researchers suggest may be harder to notice. And this might be one of the reasons for the difference between the diagnosis, the rate of diagnosis in adolescence between boys and girls. Interestingly, women who are diagnosed with ADHD, when compared to men, it tends to hit them harder. So the researchers say that they tend to have worse scores on the measures of ADHD compared to men. So although they may be presenting differently with it, they might be showing it in different ways, and they may be less likely to be diagnosed, the issues that they face may be more pervasive in women than men. And interestingly, I don't think that this is specific to ADHD necessarily, but for many women, what the researchers tell us is that the process of receiving a diagnosis and treatment is not necessarily straightforward, with many women finding their way to getting a diagnosis, perhaps when their own daughters are diagnosed or after seeking treatment for other conditions. There was one stat that really stood out to me when I was looking into this, and the researchers said that 14% of girls with ADHD were prescribed antidepressants before being treated for it, compared to only 5% of boys. So these girls were presenting with certain symptoms and being prescribed antidepressants when they weren't necessarily being screened for the ADHD. And this draws some parallels between hormonal contraceptive use, where you have teenage girls on hormonal contraceptives, and we know that there's a link between contraceptives and depression, symptoms of depression and anxiety. And even though these girls are on the hormonal contraceptives, they are also put on antidepressants instead of potentially looking at, well, what is at the root of this? And could it be related to that birth control pill that you're on, given that we know that there's this link? So I know those things aren't directly related, but I think that it does speak to the deeper issue of women and girls being treated in a certain way by our healthcare system and not always being, whether it's taken seriously or perhaps they're not necessarily investigated so that the actual root of the problem is being identified. So that's a little bit of background just to kind of get us thinking about this ADHD condition. And I also wanted to share a little bit more about the condition itself. So it is a developmental disorder characterized by developmentally inappropriate and impairing symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. One researcher described it this way. They said there are three main presentations dividing symptoms into the inattention, the hyperactive, impulsive, or a combination of the two. So we have the kind of inability to pay attention, and we also have this hyperactive component and this component of impulsivity as well. And that is what is characterizing it. So going back to the main study that we are going to be looking at today, the researchers are specifically looking to see if there is a link between the symptoms that women experience when they have ADHD and where they are in their menstrual cycle. And they did this in a number of ways. So they had these women test their saliva throughout their cycle. So they had a whole situation where they were testing the saliva, freezing it, bringing it to the lab. So they were able to kind of identify their levels of estrogen predominantly, progesterone, as well as testosterone. And specifically, they were looking at estradiol, if any of our practitioners are curious to know. And they also had the participants rate their levels of impulsivity. They had them rate their symptoms of ADHD using a variety of specific questionnaires that have been proven in other studies to be a good measure of a lot of this data. So they had a variety of different ways to look at the hormone piece of it, as well as the symptom presentation, to determine if there was a link. And I mean, unsurprisingly, I think that's what is interesting sometimes about these studies. Unsurprisingly, the researchers did find that there was a link between the symptoms that these women were presenting and what was happening hormonally with them. And I could say that again, unsurprisingly, during that luteal phase, it's always this luteal phase where we're looking at some of these increases and changes. That phase of the cycle was associated with a higher portion of these ADHD symptoms. And when they were looking at the hormones in particular, what they were saying was that the kind of lower levels of estrogen that were also associated with the higher levels of progesterone. So that is only happening in the post-ovulatory phase, because it's only after ovulation that we're seeing those higher levels of progesterone. And so, like I mentioned, they weren't having these women chart their menstrual cycles. They were having them do these daily, saliva tests. And so they were able to see where the estrogen levels were kind of independently, where the progesterone levels were independently. And they noticed that when those progesterone levels are high and the estrogen levels were lower, that combination was associated with an increase in the symptoms that they were testing for. Real Food for Fertility is your ultimate guide to optimizing your nutritional stores before pregnancy. In Real Food for Fertility, my co-author Lily Nichols and I argue that a healthy menstrual cycle sets the stage for optimal fertility and a healthy pregnancy. You can read the first chapter for free over at realfoodforfertility.com. And did you know that you can listen to Real Food for Fertility for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/realfood, one word, for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/realfood. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. And so it was interesting to see how the researchers concluded, when they looked at all this data and information, basically what they were saying was that based on the results of this, the symptoms are more variable potentially in women than previously thought, because they're seeing this variation that's directly related to their menstrual cycle, this variation in their symptoms. And it said, interestingly, toward the end, that given that we've observed these changes, I'm paraphrasing here, this may suggest the need for clinicians to ask about the cycle phase, hormonal profiles, use of hormonal birth control, or stage of life during the ADHD assessment in women. It's really interesting. I think at the end of the day, this is how progress is made. I mean, we need to have studies that are looking at these topics to kind of validate women's experiences. I would imagine that if we had women who had ADHD and they were diagnosed and they were charting their cycles and they were tracking some of their symptoms, I imagine that many of them may know that their symptoms may kick up. And interestingly, I mean, many of us who don't have ADHD find that we have certain symptoms, whether that even be things like anxiety or some of the symptoms that they talked about, whether it's the, how attentive you are throughout the menstrual cycle. It's not unlikely that women without ADHD may notice a shift in some of these symptoms throughout their menstrual cycle. So it doesn't surprise me that women with ADHD may find that some of those symptoms are more pronounced during that phase of the cycle. Now, of course, one thing that this study does not tell us is how healthy these cycles are, and if these women have other symptoms, if they have PMS symptoms, if what's even going on with their cycles, or their luteal phases the normal length. There's so much information, data, of course, that my fertility awareness brain would love to know that isn't necessarily available in a study like this. But, I suppose the next step and the next question would be that if there is this link, is it possible that supporting hormonal health and stabilizing so that there is more of a healthy balance between the estrogen and progesterone levels in the late luteal phase, would that actually result in lower symptoms for these women who are struggling with ADHD? So often when we're looking at research studies, I find that sometimes you end up with more questions than answers, because it can, does, and should spark questions for further research. So I'm really happy to see these types of studies coming to light. I'm really happy to see this kind of validation of women's experiences. I think that as women, we know, it's like we've been trying to tell you for all these years that there's changes that happen when we are going through our menstrual cycle. And it's unfortunate that we need so much scientific data to validate our experiences. And it's unfortunate that our healthcare providers may need to see studies like this to actually believe when we say that we're experiencing changes, and a variety of things can be linked to the menstrual cycle. But at the end of the day, that is the world that we live in. So it is really refreshing to see research like this being done. It's always interesting. I always find the conclusions and the comments by the researchers to be interesting, as I always share with you. But at the end of the day, I think that this is how change is made. But with that said, there is also research to show that when we have studies like this that are coming out that are cutting edge, it takes an average of 20 years or so before the latest research becomes standard practice in your conventional practitioner's office. So although there's a lot of research coming out now, it does take quite a while for it to trickle down into regular day-to-day practice. But with that said, it's still really helpful to know that this is coming out. So I'd be really interested to hear your experiences. Like I said, ADHD is a topic that is coming up more and more. There are many women, many men who have struggled with certain issues throughout their lives who are learning more about this topic, and there's advanced testing that can be done now. One of the things that, and I'll share, there was the main study that we were looking at, and there was another study that had a focus specifically on women and their diagnosis. The study is actually called Misdiagnosis, a systematic review of ADHD in adult women. So I'll make sure to link both of these studies so that you can take a look at the abstracts. But it was interesting because in that particular study, they looked specifically at women and ADHD, some of the differences in diagnoses between men and women, and also some of the specific challenges that women face to getting a diagnosis. Now, if you've been listening to the FAMM research series for a while, you may have noticed a theme that regardless of what it is that we're trying to get diagnosed, we're often facing challenges, whether that's endometriosis, whether that's PCOS, and apparently whether that is ADHD. It's just that there unfortunately seems to be this common theme that when we as women are having a variety of different symptoms, for whatever reason, it's just falling on deaf ears, or we have to go to multiple practitioners, or it can take a long time. Now, I know that experience isn't just only women. There are plenty of times when men also have to go through a lot of different providers to get diagnoses for a variety of things. But certainly when we're looking at women and our experience of healthcare, this is often a common theme. And interestingly, even in a topic like ADHD, which is very far outside of the topics that we're usually talking about on the podcast, more so related to fertility and menstrual cycle health and hormone health, it's the same story. And looking at that study, I mentioned that's termed, misdiagnosis, specifically about women's experiences with ADHD. It was certainly no different. So if this is a topic that you've been curious about, that you're wanting to dig into, you'll find the studies and details over at fertilityfriday.com/559. If you've been enjoying the FAMM research series, you can binge on our episodes out over at fertilityfriday.com/research. You'll find the list of all of our FAMM research series episodes there, where I share some interesting insights in some of the recent research that has been coming out. So lots of fun episodes for you to dig into there. So with that said, I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. If you enjoyed today's episode, you're going to love our top resource for women's health professionals, How to Interpret Virtually Any Chart Your Client Throws at You. Our newest ebook breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart.